Everyone thought it was just another petty HOA fine. $300. That was the number circled in red on the notice taped to my door, flapping in the lake breeze like a dare. Neighbors shrugged, board members smirked, and the HOA president laughed during the meeting, saying, "Pay it or fight it, either way, you lose." What they didn't know was that the joke landed on the one homeowner who reads every line, every footnote, every clause. And by the time the sun set over the water that night, the entire lake community was already on a path they couldn't reverse. I bought the lake house for the view and the quiet. $5 million for glass walls, a private dock, and mornings where the water looked like polished steel. The HOA had rules, of course, but nothing unusual. Or so it seemed. The violation claimed my dock lights were non-compliant, a technicality buried in a revised guideline passed without notice. I asked for proof. They mocked me. I asked for process. They waved me off. $300, they said, was mercy. What bothered me wasn't the money. It was the confidence. The certainty that I would fold, apologize, and move on. During that meeting, as voices overlapped and tempers rose, I noticed something strange. The treasurer avoided my eyes. The attorney cleared his throat whenever I asked about authority. It felt less like enforcement and more like performance. That's when I went home and opened the governing documents. Buried deep was a clause titled Special Maintenance and Shoreline Control. It outlined what happened when an HOA assumed responsibility over shared waterfront infrastructure. The language was old, dry, and specific. If the board enforced shoreline rules without proper notice, liability shifted. Control shifted. Not temporarily. Completely. I read it twice, then a third time, heart steady, mind racing. The next morning, I didn't argue. I didn't pay. I sent a single certified letter invoking the clause and requesting acknowledgement. No threats. No drama. Just procedure. By noon, emails flew. By evening, the board scheduled an emergency call. Their laughter from the night before was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous to them than anger. Silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes people confess to themselves. Phones stopped buzzing. The lake looked unchanged, but the balance underneath had shifted. I knew then this wasn't about lights or fines. It was about control, and I had just followed their rules better than they ever had. That realization would pull neighbors in, expose signatures, and redraw boundaries in ways no one at that meeting could imagine. And it all started with a laugh over $300. Stay with me to see how fast it unraveled. Next. The emergency call was scheduled for 7 that evening, but I logged in 10 minutes early. Not because I was eager, but because I wanted to watch who joined first. Patterns tell stories before people do. The HOA president arrived late, breathless. The treasurer joined, left, then rejoined under a different device name. The attorney didn't turn his camera on at all. No one joked this time. No one laughed. They opened by restating the violation, carefully, as if repeating it might restore their confidence. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, there was a pause that felt heavier than the lake fog rolling past my windows. Then I asked one question, calm and precise: can you confirm the date the shoreline guideline was approved and how homeowners were notified? The silence that followed wasn't technical. It was human. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else muted themselves too late. The attorney finally spoke, choosing his words like stepping stones. He said the guideline had been administratively clarified and that notification was handled internally. That was the answer I expected. I thanked him and told them I had invoked Section 14.3, subsection C, regarding unauthorized shoreline enforcement. I asked for written acknowledgement by morning. No accusations. No threats. Just a request they were obligated to answer. The call ended quickly after that. Within minutes, my inbox filled with messages from neighbors. Some were confused. Others were worried. A few asked outright what was happening. I didn't explain. I simply said the board had made a procedural error and that I was following the documents. That restraint mattered. Panic spreads faster than truth, but calm spreads deeper. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I'd won anything, but because I knew the next move wasn't mine. The clause didn't give me power by action. It gave me power by waiting. If the HOA had assumed control of shoreline rules improperly, the documents required them to either reverse enforcement publicly or transfer control to the affected owners collectively. There was no quiet fix. No backdating. No private settlement. By morning, the board sent a carefully worded response acknowledging receipt of my letter but avoiding the word clause. That omission was important. It meant they were buying time. Time, however, was exactly what the documents denied them. The clock started ticking the moment they enforced the fine. By noon, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board announcing a special review of shoreline governance. That phrase caught everyone's attention. Neighbors gathered. Conversations shifted. People who had ignored HOA meetings for years suddenly wanted copies of bylaws. Control, once invisible, was becoming a shared concern. I watched the lake from my deck, sunlight breaking across the water, and understood something clearly. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a process unfolding exactly as written, pulling more people into its orbit with every step. And once enough eyes were open, nothing about this community would be handled quietly again. By the third day, the lake community felt different. Not louder, not angrier, just alert. People waved from docks but lingered longer than usual. Conversations stopped when someone new approached. The bulletin board near the clubhouse became the center of gravity, crowded with homeowners photographing notices instead of skimming them. The HOA's special review announcement had done something unexpected. It had reminded everyone that rules only work when people understand who holds them. That afternoon, I received a message from a neighbor named Claire who lived 3 houses down the shoreline. She asked if the rumors were true, if the HOA could actually lose control over lake maintenance. I told her the truth without drama. I said the documents allowed for a transfer of authority if enforcement crossed specific lines. She didn't reply right away. An hour later, she asked for a copy of the clause. By evening, 5 more neighbors had asked the same thing. The board tried to regain footing by sending a mass email framing the situation as a minor administrative dispute. That phrasing backfired. People who had never received proper notices suddenly realized how many minor things had been handled without votes. Dock repairs. Water testing contracts. Landscaping fees along the shore. Individually small. Collectively enormous. The lake wasn't just scenery anymore. It was shared infrastructure, and control of it meant leverage over every property. On the 4th morning, a certified letter arrived at my door. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from their insurance carrier. That was the moment I knew the shift was real. Insurance companies don't ask questions unless exposure has already been flagged. The letter requested clarification on who currently held authority over shoreline assets. It included a deadline. Someone, somewhere, had run the numbers and didn't like them. The HOA scheduled an in-person meeting for the weekend. Attendance was mandatory for all shoreline homeowners. That alone told the story. They needed bodies. Quorum. Shared responsibility. When people spread accountability wide enough, no single person looks guilty. I decided to attend, not to speak, but to listen. The room was full. Faces I'd never seen at meetings before filled the chairs. The president opened with a speech about unity and community values. It sounded rehearsed, brittle. When questions started, they didn't come from the usual critics. They came from quiet owners asking simple things. Who approved this? When were we notified? Why were contracts signed without votes? Each question tightened the room. The attorney answered carefully until someone asked whether Section 14.3 still applied. He paused. Just a second too long. That pause did more damage than any accusation could have. People looked at each other, not the board. Understanding doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as a shared glance. I left early and walked back along the water. The lake was calm, but beneath it, currents moved constantly, reshaping the shore grain by grain. That's how this felt now. Slow, inevitable, and impossible to stop once set in motion. The morning after the meeting, the board tried a different strategy. Instead of notices, they sent apologies. Instead of authority, they offered cooperation. An email arrived thanking homeowners for raising valuable questions and promising transparency. It read like a peace offering, but peace only works when both sides want to forget. By then, forgetting was impossible. Claire stopped by my dock with coffee and a folder. Inside were printouts of shoreline expenses going back 5 years. She wasn't accusing anyone. She was curious, and curiosity is dangerous to closed systems. Together, we traced patterns: emergency repairs approved without bids, contracts renewed automatically, fees adjusted quietly. None of it looked criminal. All of it looked careless. By noon, a new committee was announced, the Shoreline Oversight Group, made up of homeowners. The board framed it as empowerment. In reality, it was containment. They hoped to absorb the problem into meetings and minutes. What they didn't understand was that Section 14.3 didn't allow advisory roles. It required transfer if enforcement authority had been misused. Committees couldn't fix that. The insurance carrier followed up with a second letter, this time addressed to the board and copied to shoreline owners. It warned that coverage could be suspended if authority remained unclear. That changed the temperature instantly. Insurance isn't abstract. Without it, docks close, loans get nervous, and sales stall. Suddenly, this wasn't about pride. It was about value. An emergency vote was proposed to temporarily suspend shoreline enforcement. That word, temporarily, was doing heavy lifting. Suspension didn't erase what had already happened. The fine, the notices, the assumption of control. The clock didn't rewind because people felt uncomfortable. I received a call from the HOA president that evening. She spoke softly, asked if there was any flexibility. I told her the truth. The documents allowed one path forward, and it wasn't personal. It was procedural. She thanked me and hung up without argument. That silence sounded like acceptance. The next day, surveyors arrived at the lake. Not hired by the HOA, but by a group of homeowners preparing for the transfer outlined in the clause. Clipboards replaced rulebooks. Measurements replaced opinions. Control was already moving, not through confrontation, but through compliance with the rules everyone had ignored. Standing on the dock, I realized something else. This wasn't my victory. It was the community's correction. The lake didn't belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to whoever respected the structure beneath it. And once that structure surfaced, it couldn't be buried again. Change was no longer theoretical, it had paperwork, deadlines, and signatures, and neighbors felt ownership awakening, cautious but determined, as conversations shifted from complaints to planning, from fear to responsibility, reshaping how everyone saw the water and each other together forward. By the end of that week, the word transfer stopped sounding dramatic and started sounding inevitable. Notices were no longer taped to doors or buried in emails. They were delivered by certified mail, stamped, logged, and shared. The shoreline homeowners, once passive, now met in small groups along docks and patios, comparing documents instead of gossip. The lake had become a meeting room, and everyone understood the agenda. the HOA attempted one final recalibration. They hired an external consultant, someone with an impressive resume and a calm tone, to review governance alignment. It was meant to project control. Instead, it confirmed doubt. The consultant's first request was for proof of homeowner notification regarding shoreline authority changes. That proof didn't exist. Silence, again, did the talking. Meanwhile, lenders began asking questions. A neighbor trying to refinance was asked who controlled dock maintenance. Another selling her home was asked to clarify liability for shoreline structures. These weren't hostile inquiries. They were procedural. And procedures, once triggered, don't care about intent or excuses. They care about answers. A preliminary meeting of the soon-to-be Shoreline Owners Association was scheduled. Not announced publicly, not advertised with flyers, but communicated quietly among those affected. Attendance was voluntary. Nearly everyone came. There was no shouting. No speeches. Just a shared understanding that something old had failed and something new needed to be built carefully. They asked me to explain the clause again, slowly. I did. I emphasized limits as much as power. Control came with responsibility. Budgets would be transparent. Votes would be required. Mistakes would be owned publicly. Heads nodded. This wasn't a power grab. It was a correction. That night, the HOA board sent their final message. They acknowledged improper enforcement and stated they would cooperate with any required transition. The language was neutral, almost relieved. Burden lifted can look like surrender from the outside. From the inside, it feels like survival. When the official transfer notice arrived days later, it was anticlimactic. No sirens. No applause. Just a stamped document outlining dates, assets, and obligations. Control of the shoreline, docks, and lake maintenance shifted to the homeowners collectively. The HOA retained everything else. Neighborhood lawns, pools, newsletters. The lake was no longer theirs. I walked the shoreline at sunset, watching lights flicker on across the water. The same houses. The same docks. Yet everything felt different. Not triumphant. Grounded. The balance had shifted from assumption to accountability. People stopped thanking me. That mattered. Gratitude fades. Ownership lasts. The community had learned something: expensive lessons are often hidden inside small numbers. $300 wasn't the cost. It was the trigger. And once pulled, it revealed how fragile unchecked authority really is. The lake stayed calm, reflecting a neighborhood that finally understood who held the reins and why that knowledge would shape every decision from here on out. The transition didn't make headlines, but it changed daily life in quiet, unmistakable ways. Where HOA trucks once appeared without notice, schedules were now posted weeks in advance. Where invoices used to arrive as unexplained line items, budgets were shared openly. The Shoreline Association's first act wasn't dramatic. It was boring, and that's what made it powerful. Transparency replaced assumption. Some homeowners struggled with the shift. It's easier to complain than to decide. Meetings were longer now, filled with questions about costs, responsibilities, and long-term planning. Yet even frustration felt different. It wasn't aimed upward at an unseen authority. It stayed in the room, where answers could actually form. The old HOA board kept their distance. They attended required handoff meetings, provided documents, and avoided commentary. Pride had been replaced by caution. The lake, once a symbol they wielded, was now something they observed from the outside. That separation was clean, almost surgical. No overlap. No ambiguity. One afternoon, I received a message from the attorney who had avoided my questions weeks earlier. He asked, politely, if I would confirm that the Shoreline Association would assume all future liability. I replied yes, attaching the signed documents. His response was immediate. "Thank you," he wrote. No qualifiers. No negotiation. It felt like a door closing. Property values stabilized quickly. Appraisers like clarity more than control. Buyers like knowing who decides what. The absence of uncertainty calmed the market faster than any press release could have. A neighbor who had delayed selling relisted and received multiple offers. The lake, now governed openly, became an asset again instead of a risk. At the next shoreline meeting, someone proposed a modest improvement project. Not a renovation. Just better lighting along the docks, compliant, voted on, budgeted. It passed unanimously. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Lights had started this. Lights would now be handled the right way. I found myself speaking less. That was the goal all along. Systems should work without a narrator. When people understand the structure, personalities matter less. The community didn't need a hero. It needed a rulebook that meant what it said. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the water turned copper, I stood where the violation notice had once been taped. The door was clean now. No stickers. No warnings. Just quiet. The lake reflected a neighborhood that had learned a difficult lesson without burning itself down. Power hadn't changed hands through force. It had moved through patience, documentation, and a refusal to be rushed into silence. That's how lasting change usually happens. Slowly enough to survive. Months passed, and with distance came clarity. What once felt tense now felt instructive. New homeowners moved in without ever knowing there had been a power struggle beneath the surface. They attended shoreline meetings assuming transparency was normal. In a way, that was the real victory. The correction had already blended into the culture. The Shoreline Association refined its processes carefully. Budgets were conservative. Votes were documented. Every decision carried a paper trail clear enough that anyone could follow it without interpretation. The lake wasn't just water anymore, it was a shared responsibility that taught people how governance should feel when it works. Calm. Predictable. Accountable. The HOA, for its part, grew quieter. Not weaker, just narrower. Without shoreline authority, their influence shrank to what the documents actually allowed. Lawn standards. Pool hours. Community events. The difference was noticeable. Rules felt less intrusive when they stayed in their lane. Even critics admitted things felt lighter. One evening, I ran into the former HOA president at the mailbox. It was awkward, then human. She didn't apologize, and I didn't expect her to. Instead, she said something surprising. "We forgot people read," she said. Not bitter. Reflective. Then she walked away. That single sentence explained everything. The Lake Association faced its first real test when a storm damaged several docks. In the past, this would have triggered emergency assessments and angry emails. Instead, a meeting was called, options were presented, and costs were voted on. It wasn't painless, but it was fair. People paid knowing exactly why. Ownership makes inconvenience easier to accept. I watched neighbors who had once avoided HOA matters now volunteering for committees. Not because they loved meetings, but because they understood the stakes. Control without scrutiny had nearly cost them more than money. It had nearly cost them trust. Sometimes visitors asked why the shoreline had its own governance separate from the HOA. The explanation was always simple. History. Not conflict. Just history. And history, when handled honestly, becomes a guide instead of a wound. Standing by the water one morning, I realized something else. The clause hadn't flipped control because I was clever. It flipped control because the system allowed it. Documents don't enforce themselves. People do. All I had done was refuse to ignore what was written. The lake rippled gently, reflecting homes that now felt more connected, not because they shared rules, but because they shared responsibility. That distinction mattered. What began as mockery over a small fine had ended as a lesson written into the community's habits. No plagues. No announcements. Just a quieter confidence that authority would be questioned before it was obeyed. And that, more than any document, was the change that would last. A year later, the lake hosted its first open shoreline forum. It wasn't required. No clause demanded it. The association chose to hold it anyway. Chairs lined the water, coffee sat on folding tables, and sunlight bounced off the surface in a way that made everything feel lighter than it once had. People came not to argue, but to understand how decisions were made and where money went. That alone marked how far things had shifted. The agenda was simple. Review the year. Acknowledge mistakes. Plan ahead. No one hid behind titles. Everyone spoke as an owner, because that's what they were. When questions came, answers followed without defensiveness. Transparency, once forced, had become habit. Listening from the back, I realized my role had quietly dissolved. No one looked to me for confirmation anymore. The documents spoke for themselves. The systems worked. That was the point. Influence that lingers after necessity fades becomes control, and this community had learned to avoid that trap. During the forum, someone asked what would happen if another board ever tried to overreach again. The answer wasn't legal or dramatic. It was cultural. We'd notice sooner, someone said. Heads nodded. Awareness had become the safeguard. Clauses matter, but attention matters more. Later that evening, walking home along the shore, I passed the spot where the violation notice had once been taped. I hadn't thought about it in months. It struck me then how small the trigger had been compared to the outcome. Not because the rule was severe, but because it revealed something brittle underneath. Systems don't collapse from pressure alone. They collapse when no one believes they'll be questioned. The lake reflected homes that felt steadier now. Not richer. Not flashier. Just steadier. People understood what they owned and what they were responsible for. That understanding changed how they spoke to each other, how they voted, how they planned. The HOA still existed, still functioned, still enforced rules within its scope. And that was fine. Balance had replaced dominance. Clear lines made cooperation easier than conflict ever had. I received fewer messages over time. That, too, felt right. The goal had never been to become central. It had been to become unnecessary. When governance works, it fades into the background of daily life. Looking back, the most surprising part wasn't how fast control shifted, but how quietly the community adapted once it did. There was no appetite to return to old habits. Once people see the mechanism behind authority, they don't unsee it. The lake moved gently, as it always had. What changed was the understanding beneath its surface. Power wasn't something to fear or chase. It was something to define, limit, and share. End with signatures or meetings. It ended in the ordinary moments that followed. Morning walks along the dock. Casual conversations about weather instead of rules. Children learning to fish where arguments once echoed. That's how you know a system has healed, not when people talk about it, but when they stop needing to. From the outside, nothing dramatic remained. The houses were the same. The lake reflected the same sky. Yet underneath, the community operated on a different frequency. Decisions were slower, yes, but they were sturdier. Authority no longer relied on assumption. It relied on consent, documented and visible. Occasionally, someone new would hear fragments of the old story and ask what really happened. The answer was always understated. A rule was misused. A document was followed. Control adjusted. That simplicity was intentional. The moment you turn correction into legend, you invite ego back into the system. I thought often about that first laugh at the meeting. Not with resentment, but with understanding. People laugh when they believe power is permanent. They laugh when they think no one will look closely. The most dangerous phrase in any organization isn't "this is unfair." It's "this doesn't matter." $300 mattered because it exposed a habit. A habit of shortcuts. A habit of silence. A habit of assuming compliance without accountability. The clause didn't create consequences. It revealed them. Everything that followed was already written, waiting for someone to stop looking away. What stayed with me most was how quickly people adapted once clarity arrived. There was no hunger for revenge. No desire to punish. Just a shared relief that things finally made sense. Structure doesn't limit freedom when it's honest. It protects it. Years from now, another board will form. New rules will be proposed. Another fine might be issued. That's normal. What won't be normal anymore is blind acceptance. Questions will come sooner. Documents will be read. Meetings will be attended with attention instead of habit. That's the quiet legacy of this story. Not control flipping hands, but awareness changing posture. People standing a little straighter, listening a little closer, knowing where authority begins and ends. As the sun set one last time on a day like any other, the lake shimmered softly. No notices. No warnings. Just water and homes coexisting under rules that finally matched reality. Nothing dramatic remained to be done. And that was the point.